I said the book of Ezekiel might be the weirdest book of the Bible. But the book that might be in running is the book of Revelation. Revelation may be the strangest book in the Bible. And for many, there are two approaches when it comes to the book. There are some who look at the book and quickly dismiss it with its strange symbology, weird creatures. It's easy to just say, well, it's one of the back and we'll skip over it. Maybe we'll look at the 7 churches and study that a bit. For the most part, we just ignore it and hope it'll go away. The other extreme are those who pour into it, trying to find secret hidden meaning in every detail, to the point that they create something that's not really there. But the book of the Revelation of John has a point and a purpose. And tonight I want to look at some things about the book that will help us to understand how and why it was written and how we can gain a better understanding of it. So let's start with the style. If you open up the book to chapter 1 and verse 1, it gives us a whole plethora of information right at the beginning. It says, the revelation of Jesus Christ, which God gave him to show his bondservant the things that must soon take place, he sent and communicated it by his angel to his bondservant John. We have the title of the book, The Revelation of Jesus Christ, and its author, John the Apostle. But we also have here a way that it was written. Notice here he says he sent and communicated it by his angel. If you have an older translation, it might say he signified. The word here is used in the original Greek language to mean something that was shown as a symbol. Like we might use the term a metaphor. It is the idea of something being told to us in an illusion, not illusion, but allusion, right? It's being revealed to us. And here it tells us that this whole book is written in symbolic language. You know, we use that kind of language all the time. You know, some people say, well, you can't take the Bible literally. And we'd say, well, yeah, you can. But sometimes we're not supposed to take the Bible literally when it's not written literally. Just like any other form of communication, it uses figures of speech. It uses allusion. It uses types and methodology to make a point. You know, we do that in our language. We sometimes use exaggeration to prove our point. It doesn't mean we're lying about the number, but we're using a technique. And the book of Revelation is one that uses a technique of figurative language. As we said, it's very similar to what was done last week in the book of Daniel. The apocalyptical style of literature of Daniel and Ezekiel is very kin to the book of Revelation. But whereas in the Old Testament, books of prophecy make up a large majority of the Old Testament, there is only one New Testament book, the book of Revelation, that's written in that style. And this symbolic style, this apocalyptic literature, was a form of writing that appealed to people, especially in those days. Not only in the time of Daniel, but the time between the Testaments and even in the book of Revelation. It's somewhat akin to certain times of history where a certain genre of literature becomes popular. For example, in the late 20s, 30s, the Horatio Alger tales, the rags to riches stories were popular, right? There were all these stories about some young person who started off in poverty but was able to raise himself up and achieve greatness. And that fit in with the times. Today we see a lot of stories that tell about an anti-hero, right? In a time when we don't seem to have much hope in our leadership and our leaders and our heroes, we have these anti-heroes that are very flawed people but somehow achieve something. Well, the way these stories were written, this type of literature, appealed to the little guy who wins over the bigger guy, the underdog who somehow comes out on top. And as you can see, during these time periods, the people of God were oftentimes underdogs. Right? They had gone into captivity. They had been ruled by different empires. And even in this book, the Roman Empire is this big dominant force. But this literature is to give an understanding. It's interesting because that word there that signified he communicated, it means to unveil. It's not meant to conceal, but to reveal. And many times we say, well, how do we know what it means? Well, it's coded, but knowable. And we use this all the time. You see this in political cartoons, right? You see it in idioms that we use. Language that on the surface may not make sense, but once we understand how it's written, it opens up an idea to us. And the book of Revelation is written in that way. John writes it while a prisoner on the Isle of Patmos. We'll talk about that later. And it's probably part of the reason is because this letter would have to pass through his captors to get where it was needing to go. And so by saying things subtly, he can make points that maybe he couldn't make if he did so directly. So this is the style that it's written in. The subject is also important. And by subject, I mean what it was telling. And the subject of Revelation, go back to chapter 1, verse 1, it tells us the things which soon must take place. One of the biggest mistakes people make when talking about the book of Revelation is they miss this point that's said over and over. The book is written about things that will soon take place. Many people expect Revelation to be about the end of the world. And while there are a section of it that does talk about the coming victory and the overcoming of Christians, most of the symbology is rooted in the time that it was written, the things that may soon take place. We see that at the beginning in Revelation 1:1. We see it at the end in chapter 22, verse 6 and 7. When he says, these words are faithful and true, and the Lord, the God of the spirits and the prophets, sent his angel to show his bondservant the things which soon take place. Behold, I am coming quickly. Blessed is he who heeds the words of this prophecy in this book. Once again, the time is near. The events of the book are soon. You see, what he's telling us is most of the things that they were facing were going to be coming soon. And the message was for the people that it was written to. But its principles are universal. The symbology is directed at events that were going on in their lifetime. But we can learn from them and apply it to events that go on in ours. Which leads us to the purpose of the book. The purpose of Revelation was written to those who were facing persecution to give them hope. What we see in the book of Revelation is a time period is about to break out and is already happening, but it is increasing, where the church is going to be more persecuted than it's ever been. Early on, the persecution came from the Jews who opposed Christianity. But the Roman Empire was largely, it didn't care. As long as it wasn't stirring up a riot or causing them direct conflict, they were happy to let this religious thing stay there. But because of some of the changes in the political structure, because of some of the emperors who now saw themselves as gods that must be worshipped, the challenge that they would face as Christians would become far greater. And this book is written to those who are in the midst of that. John writes this, as we said earlier in Revelation 1:9, as a fellow partaker in the tribulations. He was on the Isle of Patmos. Patmos was a prison island. It was the Alcatraz of its day. It's where you shipped off criminals to be kept away from others. And John, because of his status as an apostle, was put on this prison island. But this was not something that Christians should have been shocked about. From the very beginning, they were told in Acts chapter 14, verse 22, that through many tribulations we must enter the kingdom of God. There was never this was not a shocking thing. They had been taught from the very beginning that their faith would cause them to be persecuted, that tribulations would come. Becoming a Christian did not mean everything would be easy. If you told that to Paul, he might laugh at you. He knew what it was like to suffer for the cause of Christ. And he also knew that all Christians were going to face that. You see that reflected in the book, Revelations 2:10, as he writes to a church. He says, "Do not fear what you're about to suffer. Behold, the devil is about to cast some of you into prison. You will be tested, and you will have tribulation 10 days. Be faithful unto death, and I will give you a crown of life." You know, when we use that phrase, be faithful unto death, we mean to grow old and be faithful. But what it means here, literally, is be faithful even if it causes your death. Even if staying true means you're going to be executed for it. You're going to get an early death. He says you're going to face tribulation. Satan is at the heart of this. And Satan is using his power and influence to put the church on an attack. An attack that came from the outside and also from the inside. That they must endure and hold on. That's why they're told in Revelation 1:3, "Blessed is he who reads those and hears these words of prophecy. Heed the things which are written, because the time is near." That's why it's important we understand that it was written before those people, because they were facing it. They were dealing with it, and they needed to heed the words so that they would have the courage to go. If it was about the far future, wouldn't be much hope for people facing persecution here and now. As we said, this was the start of some of the greatest persecution against the church. We see Christians turned into the scapegoat for the failings of emperors. They were thrown to the lions. They were burned as torches. Because of their faith and their refusal to call Caesar Lord, some would be tortured, some would be cast away, some would be killed. And that kind of persecution causes people to not only question their faith, but to question God. In fact, that's one of the key scenes in Revelation chapter 6. When the Lamb is on its throne and it breaks the fifth seal, it says, "I saw the altar of souls who had been slain because of the word of the Lord, and because of the testimony which they maintained. And they cried out with a loud voice, saying, How long, O Lord, holy and true, will you refrain from judging and avenging our blood of those who dwell on the earth?" Their question was, we live for you, we died for you, but we also know, God, that you're just. When are the bad guys going to pay? When are they going to get their comeuppance? When are you going to show forth and avenge our blood? Their question might be our own question. We look at our world today and say, why does it seem that evil continues on? Why does it seem those that do wrong get away with it? Well, the book of Revelation has something to teach us about that as well. The book is written for people who are undergoing persecution, to give them hope, to give them strength, to give them understanding. That the battles they face here are part of a larger, greater conflict. One that battles that will go on through the ages, but one that will ultimately end with the complete and total victory of Christ and his church. So how else can we understand it? What about the substance of Revelation? Well, the easy way to understand Revelation is to look at it as something that wants to be explained to us, and use the things that we are given to help us figure out the things that we don't. Anytime something is written symbolically, there's a chance that someone will see that symbol differently, right? You know, we have symbols in our world today that one person looks at and sees something completely different than someone else. You go back to pre-1945, and the swastika was a symbol of good luck. It was used by Indian tribes. In fact, the United States had a regiment that used it as their symbol. But after that, the Nazis took hold of it. It means something totally different today. Right? That symbology changed. When we look at the symbology of the Bible, sometimes we see these things and they've been changed, they've been taken away, and we say, well, what does it mean? Well, the Bible's its own best interpreter, and the same thing goes true for the book of Revelation. For example, in Revelation chapter 12, we have the beginning of the second act of the book. The first part of the book tells us the introduction and gives us these messages to the individual churches of Asia. And then we have the first act that tells the story of a lamb that was slain and the seals and all these different symbology. The second half starts in chapter 12 with a great dragon that appears. It says the great dragon was thrown down in verse 9. The serpent of old, who is called the devil and Satan, who deceives the whole world, was thrown down to the earth, and the angels were thrown down with him. And we see this great dragon. Well, who could that be? Well, luckily for us, it tells us flat out, right? The dragon is what? He's the devil. He's Satan. He's the one who's been deceiving the whole world. That dragon represents Satan. So anytime we see the dragon, we can know it's talking about Satan and his work. Now, a little bit later in verse 17, it says, so then the dragon was enraged with the woman and sent off to make war against the rest of her children who keep the commandments of God and hold to the testimony of Jesus. In the previous verses, we're introduced to a woman who's about to give birth, and the dragon goes after her. And he's enraged with her, and he wants to make war with her and the rest of her children. Well, who is this woman? Well, let's ask another question before we find out her identity. Who are her children? Well, the text tells us. The children are those who keep the commandment of God and hold to the testimony of Jesus. So we know that it's the devil that is attacking what? He's attacking the woman who results in those who hold the testimony of Jesus. Let's go to chapter 13 and verse 1 and 2. It says, the dragon stood on the sand of the seashore, and I saw a beast coming up from the sea, having 10 horns and 7 heads. And its horns were 10 diadems, and its heads were blasphemous names. And the beast which I saw was like a leopard, and its feet were like that of a bear, and its mouth were that like of a lion. And the dragon gave him power and his throne and great authority. Here we have this great beast rising from the sea. Now we've already seen that the dragon is the devil. And we see that it's attacking a woman, but that woman are the faithful, or children are the ones who follow the commandments. And now it's bringing forth a great beast. Well, how can we know what this thing is? Well, it gives us some clues. One, it tells us about its heads and horns. And on these horns are diadems. What's a diadem? It's a crown. Crown represents royalty. It's a series of rulers. Right? What about this beast? Well, it's interesting because this beast is this strange amalgamation of animals, right? A leopard, a bear, a lion. Have we ever seen or heard anything like this before? If you go back to the book of Daniel, you'll remember Daniel had a vision of all these different creatures that came up, and they each got more nasty than the last, until finally there was a great beast at the end. And yet this final one that came was mightier than all of them, and it took over all the others. And what we know that those represented were the great empires that were coming up. And each one of them were a little different, but they resulted finally in this great creature. But that's when the kingdom of God would come. John is using the symbology that was already laid out in the scripture. This great empire, this great power that's going to be used by the devil. How? Verse 4, it says, they worshiped the dragon because he gave authority to the beast, and worshiped the beast, saying, who is like the beast, and is who is able to make war with him? You go down to verse 7, it says, it was also given to him to make war with the saints and overcome them, and the authority over every tribe and people and tongue and nation given to them. So what do we know about this beast? Well, it was given power by Satan, and he uses that power that he gives them to make war on the saints. The people look at this beast and say, there's nothing you can do about it. It's so powerful. It's so great. Has all this authority, has all this power. Who will be able to fight against it? He uses that power to attack who? The saints. Those same children we mentioned earlier. We see this beast that makes war on the saints. It demands worship. What could it be? Well, if we look and consider that this book is written to people of that time, the things that will soon take place, and we look back historically and we see that what the early Christians were faced with were the rise of emperors who no longer saw themselves as merely mortals, but like gods. And they demanded to be worshipped. And that worship was made a part of the emperor. And there were those who created a cult of emperor worship. And if you wanted to participate with the powers that be, you had to offer your incense and say your prayer that Caesar is Lord. He demanded your worship. If you did that, they didn't care much what you did, but you had to do that or you were against the empire. But as we said earlier, for Christians, this wasn't something they could do. Well, how can Satan have that kind of control? Notice what John says in 1 John chapter 5:19. We know that we are of God, and the whole world lies in the power of the evil one. What's this section telling us? It's telling us that the devil will use his power and his control over the world to bring forth those who will try to squash Christianity. And what we see in the early first century was the attempt was being made by Satan to bully Christians into silence, to use the powers of the empire of its day to try to stop Christians from spreading the good news. But what we see is it actually has the exact opposite effect. As one writer put it, the blood of martyrs were the seeds of the church. This persecution ends up making Christianity something special. And people are drawn to it because they say these people, they're willing to die for their faith. They stand for what's right even in the midst of persecution. And it changes everything. And in several generations, it goes from the empire is doing everything to oppose Christianity to adopts it as its religion. And that, in essence, is the big message that we don't want to miss out on in the book of Revelation. It's easy when you get caught up in all this symbology and all these things, and we don't have time tonight to go through all these things because they do require insight and understanding. But even without finding out what everything means, it's very easy to see what it's about. It's almost like when your kids drag you to some comic book movie and you don't even know who the main character is and what his powers are, but you can figure out in the end what happened, right? The good guys beat the bad guys and everybody's successful. Even if you don't understand all the symbology, you still see the message. And what is that message? That message is no matter what we face on this earth, whatever persecution is thrown our way, whatever the devil tries, if we hold on, if we stay faithful, if we overcome, in the end, God will be victorious. Even if we die for our faith, we haven't lost. Because ultimately, it will all come to an end. All the stories of Revelation do the same way. When things look like they're at their worst, right? When it seems like there's no hope, God comes in and solves everything. And all those powers that seem so big and so strong, they fade away before the sun. And that message is key for us. In Revelation 22, in verses 10 through 12, he says do not seal up these words of the prophecy of the book, for the time is near. Let the one who does wrong do wrong still. Let the one who is filthy be filthy still. Let the one who is righteous still practice righteousness. And the one who is holy keep himself holy. Behold, I am coming quickly. My reward is with me to render to every man according to what he has done. What is this part of this trying to tell us? It's telling us that we have to stay true to what we are. That God's going to see those who act wickedly, who do evil. He's going to see them for what they are. And he's going to see those who are righteous and who practice righteousness and who stay holy and keep themselves holy. That it most seem that the times are dark, but for God, he is coming. And he will reward to every man according to what he has done. The book of Revelation tells us that there will be a judgment. And that judgment will be great for the faithful. For those that stand firm, those that hold fast, those that overcome, those that see their error and repent, those that turn to the Lord, there will be hope, there will be redemption, there will be reward. But it also warns us that those who find themselves outside of God and His will, there will be punishment. There will be destruction, there will be death, and there will be loss. The book of Revelation is written to those who are Christians to give them hope, but it also serves as a warning for those who are not, that there is a judgment coming, and God will render to each man according to what he has done. So I ask you, what have you done? Many times when it comes to the battle of good and evil, we like to think of ourselves as being on one side or the other, but many times when persecution happens, when difficult times come, our tendency is to put our head down and try not to get noticed. And unfortunately, many do that in their spiritual lives. They just try to move along and not worry about it. But there is a time where we must stand up and confess what is right and what is good. We must act to show that we are truly on God's side. We do that when we confess His Son because of our belief. We do that when we change our lives because of our sin. We do that when we proclaim ourselves one of His, and we remain faithful no matter what we face. Tonight, maybe you find yourself outside of the right relationship with God. Maybe you need to obey the commandments that Jesus has given you regarding your salvation. Maybe as a Christian, you've been allowing the world to influence you and drag you down with it instead of looking up to God. Maybe tonight you need to make a change in your life, and we want to offer you the opportunity to let that need be known right now while we sing this song of invitation.